RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers. Hello, and welcome to RevOps AF, the podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Camela Thompson, and today I'm joined by Natalie Furness. Natalie, tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been doing lately.
Hi, Camilla. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Natalie Furness, the CEO and founder of RevOps Automated. We are the largest revenue operations consulting and managed services firm in Europe now. In fact, it was someone in Berlin who told me that when I attended an event recently there. So, that's an amazing milestone. My background, originally, I come from very much a data informatics background. Moved then into kind of marketing and sales before I went freelance, and then got too busy and ended up somehow running a consultancy and managed service providing firm. We do go-to-market strategy and also managed services in terms of revenue operations, which lots of people might know as RevOps as a service or fractional revenue operations.
Yeah, I'm glad we're seeing more fractional revenue operators because I think a lot of companies hesitate to invest as early as they should. So that's fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about building a high-performing organization, and this is backed by some proprietary research you all have done, and I would love to know what inspired the research in the first place.
Thanks for asking, Camilla. I'm very much on this mission to understand where RevOps can add value and ensuring that the wider business units understand the value that RevOps brings. I think a lot of the time, revenue operations can be seen as a cost center rather than an investment within a business. We're seeing some redundancy. And I'm starting to ask the question, like, why is that? Why is it that we have some businesses like ChatGPT investing $280,000 in a head of RevOps in a RevOps function? And then we've got other businesses who are getting rid of their RevOps function or turning it back to a team of one. So it was kind of this observation of the market that led me to think, okay, well, what is the difference between high-performing RevOps functions and the business is valuing them and the alternative? So I started doing some research in partnership with Pavilion, which is an executive membership group, which has a lot of C-suite executives from very well-known businesses. It's a great community as well as, of course, RevOps Co-op, where I am a member. And I just wanted to start reaching out to people. So I did some interviews, they did some interviews, we shared insights, and we put together this report about what makes efficient growth happen within the business from a RevOps point of view. Like, what is it that actually is the difference between good RevOps and perhaps RevOps that you think you can live without? So yeah, I'm happy to share some of the findings with you today, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I would love to. But before we even go there, I would love to talk a little bit about what I've noticed myself in the United States is that we are consistently inconsistent in how we architect, orchestrate, and think of revenue operations. Are you seeing something similar in Europe, or are you seeing different flavors depending on where it is? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, I don't think revenue operations is unique in the fact that it has different flavors. I think you can look at any department and see that it has different flavors across different, industries, countries, etc. I think in comparison to other business units or functions, revenue operations is in its infancy in comparison. We're not really seeing the slowing down of hiring, especially over here in Europe. I found my friends who are recruiters who specialize in revenue operations are reporting an uptick of more senior roles, not a downward trend over here. So despite there might be layoffs in some places, I'm not convinced we're on any form of downward trend. I still think we're in the early phase of sorting what revenue operations really is. So I think we're going to see that kind of forming, norming, storming, and then performing in terms of the way in which revenue operations are built. But yeah, there's so much variety. I'm seeing one person manage the end to end, and then more and more technologies just coming in and For some reason, they just think, well, one person can just continue to manage more. We're starting to see burnout, which is really sad. I've had a few people who have reached out to me to discuss how to manage that. But we're seeing the complete opposite in terms of working with businesses like Miro, who have a really extensive revenue operations facility that works very well in hands with their campaign operations and marketing and the way the sales org functions. They've actually got a very well aligned RevOps function in that business.
Interesting. Burnout has been going on for a long time, and the job description being too vast, it's reasonable to expect one person to manage so many systems that do so many things. Whether marketing or customer success is included is very variable as well. I remember when things first started, pundits were saying revenue operations is going to be the big unifier. They're going to span the go-to-market teams, yada, yada. But what we were actually seeing put in place, especially initially, was a sales analytics team that specialized in compensation for the most part. And then it's kind of evolved over time. So it's been interesting to watch.
That's interesting because when I look at the Europe side, I wonder, I mean, there are still some RevOps roles that are still really sales ops roles out there, but I think maybe we managed to kind of skip that little bit, maybe a little bit more, hopefully. We've had revenue functions for a while, but those revenue teams were very much focused more on the optimizing, like the pricing and the product and the CPQ, and focus more on that specific side. So I've seen that in around Europe for quite a while. Again, I don't think we have as many revenue operations functions probably as exist over in the US. So I've always find that we tend to be somewhere between 2 to 5 years behind, depending on what the trend is. There are certain things that, of course, Europe leads on, but this one, I think we're a lagger.
Yeah, and I would argue marketing is probably where you all lead a bit compared to the...
It's very difficult to know without being in both countries and being able to do an experiment by being in them. So maybe sometimes as British, we can be a bit self-deprecating and probably be like, well, no, we probably aren't. But I don't know if that's just because we're being British or just because I don't know. But you guys definitely seem to have the pizzazz, which we have less of. But I think in terms of operating focus and operations people and that kind of attention to scientific rigor and things, I feel like we have some strengths in that area as well.
Great. Well, thank you for letting us diverge a bit from that. I was just very curious. Let's dig into the research a little bit. What are some of the core findings that just really jumped out at you?
Yeah, so one of the key things that Mark Roberg, who is one of the partners at Stage 2 Capital, talked about is that really your revenue operations team should be providing at least 2x return on investment for every pound that you're spending or dollar that you're spending, which I found a really interesting insight because it made me question like, how are we actually measuring return on our investment from revenue operations team? And this got us thinking about the metrics of, are we increasing the revenue per head? Because really, that's potentially something that we can use as a baseline. Are we even thinking about collecting baseline and then looking at optimizing against either time saved or revenue generated? And what metrics can we own as revenue operations? And I think one of the key insights that was found from some of this research is that revenue operations professionals need to get much better at putting in place a baseline and a forecast of their impact, and then the actual impact for all of the projects that we run. It's easy for sales to be like, I won this many deals. Marketing is starting to look at attribution. Of course, we can debate attribution for a long time, but
Indeed,
as RevOps professionals, how are we illustrating that we are changing the volume, conversion rate, acceleration, time spent, or cost on headcount? How are we changing those things? Because ultimately our job really is to reduce headcount and grow business, if we really think about it.
And I see a lot of revenue operators claim it's not possible to measure because there's so many other factors going into it. And that makes me uncomfortable because if you can't make an argument, then why be at the business, right? Like every department has to prove its value. Every department has standard metrics. We should probably figure that out. So have you seen anything in particular work? I have some project examples that are very specific, but would love to hear what you've seen work.
For me, it's about aligning yourself with the metrics of the stakeholders that matter. I don't think we can have a one size fits all. My recommendation to people is get to know the CFO of the business, or at least get to understand what the CFO is prioritizing. As well, if you have a COO, CEOs tend to be slightly harder because they're not always data-driven people, CEOs, especially if they're CEOs founders. I'm sure those of you who have worked with CEO founders will understand the variety that exists out there. I would avoid trying to align yourself with the CROs metrics, because we know we can see a variety of CROs, and very rarely are these CROs true CROs of how we would expect them to be full funnel. They do tend to be a progression of sales leaders. And avoid getting carried away by a marketer who's starting to talk about brand. Just try and align yourself with CFO, COO. If you've got a very data-driven CRO or CMO that's very well respected on the board of directors, but align yourself with the metrics that matter to the people who matter to the board.
That's great advice. So maybe a couple examples. I can think of one and then I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, Camela, share.
So ages ago, one of the key concerns of the business was lack of productivity on the side of the inside sales team. There's always the marketing to sales handoff, investigating all the different things that can go wrong, whether it's systems, definitions, misalignment, all of those good things. So before the project took place, you take a bunch of benchmarks. And when I did this, I wasn't sure what all would be impacted. So it's time to lead conversion, quantity of conversion, so percentage, and pipeline generated beyond that. So taking a lot of different measurements, and then once the project's complete, you do additional measurements at the 1, 3, 6, 9 month marks, and then communicate back to the business how things have improved or not improved. So barring other changes, and there will be other changes at 6 and 9 months, but, if they've generated $1 million more in pipeline after month 1, because you've reprioritized how the leads are showing up, you've changed the definition, you're no longer passing along leads that aren't likely to convert, that's a big statement that you can put on your resume and communicate to the business. That's one example. I would love to hear other things that you all have used.
Yeah, I mean, that's ticking a lot of the boxes that I'm thinking about. There's so many case studies, but one specific one which we won an award for actually was we helped transform EV charge infrastructure business, which was very different because it wasn't a SaaS play. It's not like your standard. It was an infrastructure play. And in fact, they didn't actually even measure success by revenue because it's an infrastructure play. They measure success based on the number of charge points in the ground. So a lead has to go from being a B2B lead to chatting to sales, to agreeing, to having engineers going out, national grid going out, checking energy supply, placing the charge points in the ground, getting an agreement, lots of moving parts at the same time. So we had to break down what were all the bottlenecks to this process. To start with sales, there was revenue leakage because we were getting a reduced conversion from leads to even having that first discussion to send an engineer out. Then we identified the fact that there was no visibility on whether the engineers had gone or not. So every point there was issues across the pipeline. So we're taking baselines of number of sites visited, the time in which it takes to get a contract completed, the time of which the approval was needed from the C-suite, and the overall number of charge points in the ground over a period of time. We actually saw we measured over a year that we had achieved over 523% return on investment for them from the work that we did in terms of hours paid for the RevOps function, because we improved the speed in which engineers were getting to sites because the sales team had visibility and would chase them up if they missed appointments. So that visibility created that. the commercial, because of the contract management system that was speeding up the iterations of the contracts, because of the auto approval management system for the C-suite, instead of taking 4 days to approve, it was taking 4 minutes, or ones that they didn't even need to approve because they weren't over a certain threshold. So it was then saving the sales team time. We then asked, if we hadn't done that, how would you have coped with this workload as the business scaled? And the COO said, I would have had no choice but to hire a sales administrator. To which we said, and how much would that sales administrator cost? 30 to 40 grand a year. So you also have to ask, what would the business have done if you hadn't done what you did? Because if it's another head, you could basically say, well, over 10 years, I've saved you 400 grand because of what we've done. So it's looking at it more like cost savings or revenue gains. I think those numbers speak to C-suite leaders.
Yeah, and maybe we talk just really quickly about what different types of organizations want to see, because it changes depending on how they're financed and
Exactly.
their exit strategy. So assuming you're not a publicly held company, if you're private equity, and it's changed a little bit because venture-backed, I don't see the same quite as aggressive behavior. There's a little bit more attention to profit margin. But back in the day, it was very different. Private equity traditionally has been much more mindful about cost, profit margin, and ensuring that it's an attractive proposition for acquisition or merger. So do you want to go maybe into venture-backed and other flavors you've seen out there?
Yeah, so if they've got an aggressive growth at all cost mentality, these aren't businesses that I've had as much involvement with. If they have a high growth with the focus of raising additional rounds, so they need to have a level of profitability, that's where we've seen revenue operations play a role, because ultimately you need to be showing growth. So you're going to need to be, a lot of the time they're focused more on the net new revenue side than perhaps the retention referral side. So that kind of left side of if you're using the bow tie model, left side. So you're going to need to be showing great growth there and reducing the cost of acquiring a customer. They might not necessarily be focused, especially if they're in the early stages of fundraising, lifetime value, retention rate, things like that aren't going to be as important. As we get into the later rounds, the BCs, beyond, those sort of churn metrics, retention are going to play a part. So you're going to see the attention shift to be more full end-to-end bow tie. And it's usually after the B that we start seeing people get more interested in having these life cycle stage metric analysis and actually wanting to understand the volume, conversion rates, acceleration through the whole system. Although I don't think that the right side of the bow tie is getting as much attention as it should be. I think we should be spending more time there. Interestingly, though, we've had a surprising amount of businesses recently that are actually telling us they don't have an acquisition problem. They actually have a cost of servicing problem. As in, like, they've almost been able to sell a lot, but then they can't service to the quality that they want within the budget that they have. So we're actually spending a lot more time trying to figure out some of those problems for our clients now, which we hadn't really foreseen doing. One example being a executive recruitment firm who is growing very quickly. And they've managed to generate a lot of contracts, but then they've got to fulfill the searches. So then we're looking at the operating system behind fulfilling the searches and what technology stack can we use to aggregate all the candidates from all the different platforms, and how can we save those teams time on delivering revenue? That's kind of like those early stage high growth stuff. The PE stuff, they are way more focused on cost savings. So there's kind of this difference between cost cutting and efficiency. And the thing is that this is when, as a RevOps professional, you need to be showing your impact on the P&L, because if you don't, you are a cost, not an investment. And I think maybe this is a question I can ask you, Camela, in terms of how many revenue operations professionals think on this strategic level? in this importance of our impact on the P&L and that side?
I think more want to, but aren't always aware how to tie everything together, which is why I keep pushing for specific examples. I think that's a great question because it took me a long time, and working for a private equity company and knowing that I had to prove my value, to really start thinking about, okay, what do they really care about? Because I'm not in the boardroom. I can't see what they're talking about. And since being in the boardroom, I was like, oh, that's why they ask all those questions. So I think it would be really helpful to people if we were more transparent about what the board cares about. And I understand why we aren't always. For private equity, for example, if our end goal is an acquisition or merger, that's how long the business is going to be around. That can make people nervous, and it can cut down on or increase your attrition, right? But I think a lot of people want to be, but they're not always brought into the fold or understand or coached to a degree to really understand what the CFO and CEO board care about.
Yeah, and I think it's this sort of stuff that's making me think about, and I am in the process of developing a strategic revenue operations consulting certification to help people think that bit more strategically. And it's conversations like this that are helping me develop the content. And I'm really looking forward to going to Berlin to meet everybody at RevOpsAF, like learning from them and hearing their challenges so that we can really tailor some more educational stuff to raise the strategic mindsets of our RevOps professionals. Because that's what's going to get us on the map as a function that matters, is we need to take control over our strategic positioning.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the executive roundtables that we had at the RevOps Co-op, we'd ask how many people have any friction being included in executive reviews or meetings like that. And half the room was saying, oh, we didn't even think about that because we're already included. And the other half of the room is saying, wait, they just let you in there? Because they had to fight their way. So there's vastly different experiences depending on who you talk to. So I think that's so fabulous. And we're very happy to have you at RevOpsAF Berlin for sure.
Yeah, I'm excited. The only other thing that I would say was a real interesting insight from the research. And of course, I will be sharing more at the event. But it's the importance of understanding the skill mix you need in your RevOps function. Because if somebody is very good at strategic thinking and analysis, they're not going to be the person you have day in and day out engineering a system. If you pick one person to do both, you will either have an inefficient strategist or a slow architect. So it's important to remember that while we can be generalists and that's great, we all have our own individual superpowers we need to lean into, and we need to embrace being part of a function where we work with other people. Together, we're building a super function.
Yeah, I think people sometimes get frustrated with how much I hammer on soft skills and knowing your own weaknesses, because that informs how you hire. But it is so critical to understand what you should and shouldn't be doing. It's like, can you do it? Sure. Is that the best use of your time and the business's resources? Maybe not. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Natalie, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really enjoyed having you here. Where can people find you to network?
The easiest place to get hold of me is LinkedIn. Please feel free to DM me. You can also visit RevOpsAutomated.com. We have a ton of free resources, from HubSpot Salesforce integration mapping to lead scoring to how to build a strategic RevOps roadmap. So it's all free and accessible for all of RevOps Co-op members and the wider public.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOps safe, y'all.